Ancient Faith Radio brings you the Law of the Spirit with Father Maxime Lissac. Questions and answers on the spiritual life. Father Maxime is the priest at Christ the Savior Orthodox Church in Ottawa, Ontario.
The question is about addiction to particular sinful thoughts. How can a person assess, or perhaps more likely, have someone else assess, whether that particular thought, repeated thought, represents an addiction? In fact, one of the words for addiction is passion. When we talk about a passion, we're talking about something that is repeating. So what are some of the features of this in the spiritual life, of an addictive thought, or perhaps more accurately, of an addiction itself? The great spiritual fathers write about this in great detail. A number of spiritual fathers do that. One of the classic examples is St. Mark the ascetic, St. Mark the monk, a very well-known father, although you could certainly consult St. John of the Ladder and a number of the other well-known masters of the spiritual life. Well, first of all, when you have an addiction, it means that it is impossible to break it with willpower alone. Simply repeating, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do this, is not going to cut it. You won't be able to do that precisely because it is an addiction. And I think to understand a little bit more about this, we would have to know a little bit about the spiritual thought process. Now we are beginning to understand a little bit more about the physiological aspects of how the brain works. That gives us only part of the story, however. Spiritually, we need to know how this works. And from what we know, when we have a sinful thought that has trapped us in a kind of addiction, there is a pathway. If you could imagine for a moment a thought moving along a pathway, like a charge moves along an electric circuit. It follows a pathway. And this pathway becomes ingrained in our hearts. And so when we sin, we only need a trigger, and the thought begins, and it follows the familiar pathway, moving from one step to another, with certain images, with certain feelings. These are all of the components, if you like, of the thought, and it has a movement to it, a dynamic. That pathway has to be broken in order for a person to be free. And precisely because the pathway is not only familiar, but a person begins to feel that that pathway is part of him or her, it's very, very difficult to pull away from the thought. Because once it's engaged, it has, people will say, and we all know it, virtually a life of its own. It just simply follows the path. That's the sign of an addiction. Another sign is when you find pleasure, meaning, or perhaps even comfort in it. And well, none of these things serve us spiritually, ultimately. Nevertheless, we become convinced that we really can't or won't, could be a little bit of both, do without it. We need that kind of comfort. We have to think along these lines. Perhaps because we are afraid of something, and almost certainly because there's some kind of a spiritual void. And so in order to address this, the void, the spiritual emptiness, needs to be addressed. But first of all, some kind of accurate diagnosis needs to be made. And we know there's an addiction when there's the same basic pathway that occurs again and again and again. When a person invests a lot of meaning or derives comfort from it, and when a person is unable to assert him or herself over and against the thought.
If you have a question on the spiritual life, you can write to Father Maxim at lawofthespirit@ancientfaith.com. And be sure to like this podcast on Facebook. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.